For decades, the defining geopolitical assumption of our era has been the rise of China. This was not a fringe view. It was the consensus of governments, intelligence agencies, universities, and financial institutions across the world. China was going to surpass the United States. China was going to dominate the 21st century. China was the inexorable force reshaping the global order, growing faster, manufacturing more, building more, and accumulating power at a pace that made the rest of the world nervous. That assumption is wrong. And the data that proves it wrong is not speculative, not theoretical, and not dependent on any future event going badly for China. It is already in the numbers. And those numbers, when you read them carefully, tell a story about structural forces so large and so irreversible that they are already reshaping the global balance of power, whether or not the world has caught up to that reality. In January 2026, China's National Bureau of Statistics published the population data for 2025. The numbers stopped demographers in their tracks. In 2025, China recorded 7.92 million births and 11.31 million deaths. China's population declined by 3.4 million people in a single year, more than double the 1.4 million decline recorded in 2024. It was the fourth consecutive year of population loss. And the birth rate of 5.6 per thousand people was the lowest recorded figure since 1949, the year the People's Republic was founded. The American Enterprise Institute's Nicholas Eberstadt, one of the world's leading demographers, described the 2025 birth figures as a demographic shock of the kind normally associated not with orderly progress, but with famine, plague, or wartime upheaval. He noted that China's 7.92 million births in 2025 represented less than 2/5 of the country's birth total just 9 years earlier, in 2016. This is not a problem on the horizon. This is a structural transformation already underway. Welcome to Global Faultlines, where we track the forces beneath the surface of global events. Today's analysis examines what the verified data from China's demographic crisis, its debt structure, its real estate collapse, and its compounding geopolitical exposure tell us about the direction of the world's second largest economy, and what that direction means for the global balance of power. This is the most important geopolitical story of the next 2 decades, and most of the world has not yet caught up to it. Let us begin with the demographic data, because it is the foundation on which everything else rests. China's fertility rate currently stands at approximately 1 birth per woman. The replacement level, the rate needed to maintain a stable population, is 2.1 births per woman. In China's major cities, including Beijing and Shanghai, the fertility rate is even lower than the national average. In 2025, deaths exceeded births by 3.39 million, the largest single-year natural population decline China has ever recorded in modern times. According to projections published by the Rhodium Group and confirmed by United Nations demographic data, China's population is set to decline by nearly 60 million people between 2026 and 2035, a loss roughly equivalent to the entire population of France within the space of a single decade. By 2050, according to RAND Corporation analysis published in April 2026, China's population could be 250 million smaller than its peak, a loss equal to approximately 3/4 of the current U.S. population, occurring within the lifetimes of people already alive today. The workforce implications of this trajectory are severe and already visible. China's working-age population peaked in 2015. It has been declining since. By 2050, there will be fewer than 2 working-age adults in China for every person aged 65 or older, compared with more than 2.5 in the United States. By that same year, nearly 1 in 3 Chinese citizens will be 65 or older. No country in recorded history has reached that level of demographic aging. The Beijing government is acutely aware of the crisis. In July 2025, it launched a nationwide childcare subsidy program allocating 90 billion yuan, approximately $12.5 billion US dollars, to benefit an estimated 20 million families. In February 2026, it issued a directive requiring social media platforms to censor content deemed to spread, in the government's words, fear of marriage or anxiety about childbirth. The fact that a government censoring its internet to prevent people from expressing anxiety about having children is the most revealing signal of how desperate the situation has become. The one-child policy, enforced for more than 3 decades, did not simply limit births. It rewired the social contract around family formation for 2 full generations. You cannot undo that by issuing a directive and offering a subsidy. As the Asia Times noted in February 2026, once fertility falls to the depths China has reached, International experience consistently shows that incentives can slow the decline but rarely restore balance. The causes are structural: urbanization, housing costs, education costs, and a fundamental shift in the social conception of family life that policy cannot reverse on any short timeline. Now let us examine the economic architecture, because the demographic crisis does not exist in isolation. It is compounding a debt structure that carries its own set of systemic risks. China's official government debt-to-GDP ratio appears manageable by international standards. That is because China's official statistics exclude the most significant component of its actual debt burden. Local governments across China borrowed heavily through off-budget financing vehicles, known as local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, to fund infrastructure projects during the decades of rapid growth. According to IMF analysis cited by ARC Group, this accumulated hidden debt reached approximately 60 trillion yuan, equivalent to 8.2 trillion US dollars, by the end of 2023. That figure represents nearly 48% of China's GDP, in debt that does not appear in official budget figures. China's Ministry of Finance has acknowledged a portion of this as implicit or hidden debt, approximately 14.3 trillion yuan as of 2023. The broader figure, however, is a burden that the IMF assessed would require resources equivalent to approximately 5% of GDP over several years, simply to resolve the distortions it has created in the property sector alone. The property sector is where the debt crisis is most visibly expressed, and where its impact on ordinary Chinese citizens is most acute. China's real estate market historically represented approximately 25% of GDP, a structural concentration that made the economy extraordinarily vulnerable to any disruption in housing. Housing prices have fallen more than 20% since they peaked in 2021, according to Rhodium Group analysis confirmed by ABC News and HSBC. Real estate development investment fell 15.9% year-on-year in the January through November 2025 period. New construction starts declined more than 20%. Private investment, the investment that flows into productive economic activity rather than government-directed projects, declined 5.3%. The Rhodium Group, one of the most rigorous independent assessors of Chinese economic data, estimated that China's actual GDP growth in 2025 fell short of 3%, significantly below the official figure of approximately 5%. The Consumer Price Index has not increased on net in 3 years. Chinese export prices have fallen more than 20% since early 2022. The country is experiencing deflation, a condition in which falling prices suppress corporate revenues, reduce investment, increase the real burden of existing debt, and create a self-reinforcing downward spiral that is historically very difficult to escape. The World Bank projects China's GDP growth at 4.4% in 2026. The IMF projects growth declining to 3.4% by 2028. Both sets of projections are based on the official data, which independent analysts like the Rhodium Group suggest significantly overstates actual performance. Here is the structural trap that the data reveals, and it is the most important analytical point in this entire analysis. China's rise was built on 2 engines: a massive and growing population providing cheap industrial labor, and an aggressive program of debt-financed investment that turned that labor into exported manufacturing output. Both engines are now running in reverse. The population is shrinking, aging, and producing fewer workers every year. The debt that funded the investment has reached levels where an increasing portion of it is being directed not toward productive economic activity, but toward keeping people employed in unproductive projects, to prevent the political consequences of visible unemployment. The IMF assessed that resolving China's property sector distortions alone would require resources equivalent to 5% of GDP over several years. China's central and local governments are issuing net new debt of approximately 10 to 15 trillion yuan per year simply to maintain current activity levels. This is debt being used to service the political requirements of the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy claim, not to create the productive capacity that could eventually pay down that debt. And the demographic decline means that each unit of debt is being spread across a smaller and smaller workforce, making the per capita debt burden worse every year. The Rhodium Group's demographic analysis published in April 2026 described this as a gray rhino for China's economy, a clearly visible charging threat that has nonetheless been consistently underestimated. Their projection that China will lose nearly 60 million people in the next decade, with annual population decline accelerating to 7.6 million by 2035, represents a scale of demographic contraction that will fundamentally constrain economic performance regardless of what policy responses Beijing implements. Now let us examine the external pressures compounding these internal structural forces, because 2025 and 2026 have introduced geopolitical shocks that China's economy is particularly ill-positioned to absorb. The U.S.-China trade war has imposed tariffs of 30% or higher on Chinese exports to the United States. According to China Briefing, Chinese shipments to the United States fell nearly 29% year-on-year in November 2025. Exports to the U.S. had been one of the primary stabilizing forces for China's economy throughout 2025, compensating partially for the weakness in domestic demand and investment. As that channel contracts under tariff pressure, the stabilizing force disappears. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, triggered by the U.S.-Iran conflict that began in February 2026, has created an energy shock with particularly severe implications for China. China is the world's largest net importer of crude oil, purchasing approximately 11 million barrels per day in 2023, according to IEA data. A significant portion of that oil transits the Strait of Hormuz. When the strait's flow collapsed from more than 20 million barrels per day to approximately 3.8 million barrels per day, according to IEA's April 2026 oil market report, China's industrial energy costs rose sharply, directly compressing the profit margins of the manufacturing sector that remains the core of its export model. China's industrial competitiveness depends on energy costs. When energy costs rise and simultaneously the demand for Chinese manufactured exports falls under tariff pressure, the two pressures squeeze the manufacturing sector from both sides simultaneously. As IEA data and trade analysis confirm, this is precisely the environment China is operating in during the first half of 2026. China's response to its own energy vulnerability has been to build strategic petroleum reserves significantly larger than those of most other major economies. But reserves are a buffer, not a solution. They buy time. They do not resolve the structural dependence on imported energy that makes China's industrial economy vulnerable to every disruption in global energy supply routes. Let us now examine what this convergence of forces means for the global balance of power, because this is the strategic picture that Global Faultlines exists to provide. The conventional model of China's trajectory, continuous rise, inevitable superpower status, eventual replacement of the United States as the dominant global power, was built on projections derived from a historical period that has ended. That period was characterized by a growing population, an unlimited supply of cheap industrial labor, and an economy with vast room to grow simply by adopting existing technologies and production methods. All three of those characteristics are now either reversed or exhausted. China's population is shrinking. Its labor costs have risen to the point where, according to multiple industry analyses, the fully loaded cost of manufacturing, including energy, labor, logistics, and regulatory compliance, is in some sectors comparable to or higher than manufacturing in the United States. Its debt has reached levels where new borrowing generates less economic output than the interest it costs to service. India surpassed China as the world's most populous nation in 2023. India's median age is 28.2 years, compared to China's 40.6 years as of 2026. India has a young, growing workforce. China has an aging, shrinking one. The RAND Corporation's April 2026 analysis noted that by 2049, the centennial of the People's Republic, China may have fewer men of military age than it had at the founding of the state in 1949. That single statistic captures the scope of the demographic reversal in terms that go beyond economic output to the fundamental question of state power. None of this means China will cease to be a significant global power. China remains the world's second largest economy, a nuclear-armed state, the world's largest manufacturer, and a country with formidable technological capabilities in artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, renewable energy, and advanced manufacturing. These are real strengths that do not evaporate. But the trajectory has changed. The direction of travel has reversed. And the convergence of demographic decline, structural debt, real estate collapse, export pressure from tariffs, and energy vulnerability from the Hormuz closure means that China is, for the first time in a generation, managing multiple simultaneous structural pressures with no obvious policy escape route from any of them. As the Asia Times noted in February 2026, China is now a superpower entering old age. The era when population growth quietly compensated for economic and institutional shortcomings has ended. What follows will be a more demanding phase, one in which choices are costlier and margins for error thinner. Here's the strategic picture that Global Faultlines is here to provide. The global order has been organized for the past 30 years around the assumption that China's rise was the defining geopolitical fact of the era, the force that all other countries had to orient around, respond to, and prepare for. That organizing assumption is now structurally challenged by the data. This does not mean the world becomes simpler or safer. Declining powers, historically, are often more dangerous than rising ones, precisely because the tools available to them for reversing their decline narrow as the decline accelerates. A China that cannot solve its demographic crisis through economic growth may seek other solutions. A China that cannot maintain its citizens' living standards through export-led manufacturing may redirect political energy toward nationalist narratives. A China that sees its window of relative power closing may recalculate the timing and cost-benefit of strategic moves it might otherwise have deferred. Understanding that China's structural position has shifted is not a reason for complacency. It is a reason for more sophisticated analysis, the kind that goes beyond the headline GDP figures to the demographic data, the hidden debt, the real estate collapse, and the compounding external pressures that the verified institutional data now confirms are all moving in the same direction simultaneously. That is exactly what Global Faultlines is built to do. If today's analysis gave you a clearer picture of the forces reshaping global power, share it, subscribe, come back, because the fault lines beneath China's rise have been building for a generation, and in 2026 they are no longer theoretical. This is Global Faultlines. See beyond the headlines.